Hey folks!
Hey allihopa!
Welcome to another video.
Today we are rounding up what we read in the month of September.
The first book I finished was A Blood Condition by Kayo Chingoni. It's a little conceptual in the sense that it's a poetry book, and it is kind of looking at the history of a blood disease, and it's not ever stated what, but I assume probably HIV. Through the ages, it refers to like gay sex and things, but also like the HIV epidemic in Africa, especially South Africa, and all kind of touching on all of those, which are important topics, but I didn't think that it was very successful in its message. Like, it was just kind of like, these things are happening. And then, obviously, I know why they're important, but I was kind of feeling like, so what? You should be telling me more about what I need to be thinking or feeling about it, and it was just kind of like, and this happened, and this happened, and it kind of wasn't even really like, and isn't that terrible? It wasn't quite enough for me, I think, for it to really reach its potential, but I think it could reach its potential if it were reworked, or like future poems by this person.
The first book I finished this month was Anyway the Wind Blows by Rainbow Rowell. This is the third book in the Simon Snow trilogy. This basically follows the event of the second book. I don't know if I should say what happened in this book, but okay, spoilers. We'll put spoilers on the screen. Kind of want to talk a little bit about stuff that happens in this book that I really enjoyed, but I saw some like reviews kind of not enjoying it. Basically, in the second book, Simon and Bass kind of break up, but they don't really. They're kind of like in a in-between sort of stage. But then in this book, they kind of like very early on decide to like, actually, we should try and like really work on our relationship together. And I was like, wow, that's great. Like, I enjoy seeing that in like young adult fiction because that never ever happens. I mean, the book in general, like, I gave it 4 stars because I really liked this book, but like it was a little slow going. There was not a lot of like stuff that happened, but that specific thing I thought was really good. Otherwise, this book would have been them breaking up, and then like when there was 50 pages left of the book, they would have gotten together and not talking about their relationship. Whereas in this, they continuously had a discussion about their relationship and what they wanted and like how they felt for each other, and that it's difficult because they're young. It's like their first relationship, their first really committed relationship. And I'm like, wow, that's great. More of that, please. Other than that, I think the second book for me was the best one because I felt like they were doing stuff in that one. They were like on a road trip and kind of like trying to save someone. Whereas in this one, they kind of come back to England and it's just kind of like, it was fine.
The next book I read was Black on Both Sides, A Racial History of Trans Identity by C. Riley Snorton. I was actually really looking forward to this book. It had been on my kind of to-read list when I have time. I don't really have a TBR list per se, but that was a book that I had seen and I was like, I am very interested in that. So I did eventually read it, and I was kind of disappointed because I thought it would be more about racialized trans identity, and it wasn't really. The first section is not about trans identity at all. It's about gynecological torture that Black slaves endured in America. Like, that is horrifying and also very interesting, and I was glad to learn more about it. I think the book was trying to talk about too many things, and it was so densely theoretical that I found it really, really difficult to read. Like, full of jargon, and every single sentence was a quotation from another book or like another article or something, and I just found that really difficult. The only section that actually is about Black trans identity is the second section, and the third section is about a Black man who was peripheral to a trans person. It just felt like Snorton hadn't focused it enough. I think I was also maybe expecting a history of Black trans identity, which would have been very interesting because while I do know some things, I don't know that much about it. So having like people were trans in the past, way deep in the past, and this kind of started in the 19th century and moved from there, and I kind of thought it limited it in a way. It was disappointing. Worth reading if you're willing to wade through the jargon.
The next book I listened to, but I also have a physical copy of, is Legendborn by Tracy Dion. This follows Bree. Sorry, it feels like it's been 2 months since I read this book for some reason. And she is like a high school student, but she's allowed to go to like college or like to be on the college campus in North Carolina, I think she is. Because she's very like good in school, basically, and I think that's to like prep her to have a scholarship. Anyway, it's irrelevant. Her mom has died very recently, and she's kind of like, something happened, like something's going on. And then she realizes that she has like magical powers, and that there's like a secret society of these like warlocks, wizards of the kind. They're descendants of Arthur of this country. King Arthur and his like round table. Yeah. She thinks that they know maybe what happened to her mom. I really enjoy this book. This is like a really good young adult fantasy. I didn't really have that many issues with it. It like touches on like racism and grief and really good topics. Also has like a little bit of a romance, which I love. I enjoyed this. It was good. You should read it. The narrator is really good too. If you want to listen to it on audiobook, recommend. It's really good. I can't wait for the second book.
The next book I read was Scottish Love Poems, edited by Antonia Fraser. It states a lot that it's a personal anthology, so it's not like representative of Scottish love poetry. It's what Antonia Fraser likes, basically.
Good for him.
Fair enough. You know, like, you can do what you want, but because of that, our tastes didn't necessarily align always. It was pretty interesting, and I hadn't read a great deal of Scottish poetry, but a lot of it was written in Scottish, like Gaelic, or in like dialect, which makes it very difficult to read. I don't know if anyone has ever read like Scottish tweets, and you're like, what? Some of the poems were written like that, and you have to read it and think, how would a Scottish person pronounce this so that I can understand what the letters that are here mean? Which made it very difficult to read. There were some poems that I really liked that I learned about in this book. I gave it 3 stars. It was what it was.
The next book I finished was She Who Became the Sun by Shelley Parker Shan. This mainly, I mean, it has multiple POVs, but it mainly follows Shu. She grows up very poor, and basically her older brother is said to become greatness, but then he dies, and then she decides, and her fate is supposed to be nothing, so she decides to take his life, or like to become him, because she wants greatness. And then she becomes a monk. When she's at this monastery, a eunuch general comes and like destroys the monastery, and then you follow the eunuch general, and they're like from opposing worlds and everything, and then Shu Shangba becomes also a general or something. It's a lot of stuff going on in this book. I kind of like this book. I gave it 3 stars because I did think it was a little like, Shu has like a lot of things happen and it just goes well for her. And I'm like, it's a little too easy for her. I mean, I imagine maybe in the second book she will struggle a lot or something. But I think that was like my main, like, she kind of just like slid through the book. I mean, yes, she had to like pretend to be a man for the entire time of her life, but I still felt like when she was up against like an army, or she had to like figure out how to do the next step or whatever, it just kind of like, here, this is how it will go, and it just kind of happened. And then there's a lot of like time jumps, and I was just kind of like, oh, it's just a lot going on. It's well written, and I would like recommend people reading this, but I'm still a little bit like, there was something that wasn't just like, that sat right with me with this book. and I can't really figure out what it was. Overall, it's really good, especially like talking about like gender roles and like gender in general. This book was really good. I will maybe read the second book just to see what happens, and maybe then I'll figure it out.
The next book I read was Black Girl Call Home by Jasmine Mans. I really quite enjoyed this. It's also poetry. I read quite a lot of poetry this month. It's kind of about stuff that's happening in the world, racism, misogyny, homophobia, like all of these things, and the thread is kind of that she's thinking about her home or making her own home, leaving home, all of that. So like talking about her mother, talking about her family, talking about new relationships or relationships that are ending, and all the while also making commentary about the world at large. I thought it was very interesting. I think possibly the poems that were weakest were the poems that were only about what's happening in the world, because it didn't have that personal feel or the lens of interpretation that I felt that Jasmine Mans brought to some of the other poems. But I would recommend this. I enjoyed it. I thought the writing is really good.
The next book I listened to, but also have a physical copy of, is Beyond a Darkened Shore by Jessica Leek. This follows Kira? Is that right?
That's how you pronounce it.
Yeah, but I'm like, was that her name? I mean, it's in first person, I think, so that might be why So this follows Kira, and she is like a princess, kind of. Basically, her home, village, town, whatever you call it, is attacked by the Norsemen, Vikings, and she has like a power where she can like control other people's minds, kind of make them stop doing things. So basically her army wins, but she takes one of the Norsemen that she couldn't control as a prisoner, and his name is Leif, but that's how you say it in Sweden. In the book, his name is Leif.
I'm so sorry.
That's okay. That was my main gripe with the book, and he's also like the love interest, and I was just like, no, that's not how you say his name. Anyway, it doesn't matter.
She talked about it constantly.
Yes. Yeah, and then they kind of have to like team up to stop frost giants. Sorry, there's just kind of a lot of stuff happening in this book. I gave this like a 3 stars. Like, this was perfectly fine young adult fantasy book. I didn't think it was good or bad. It was just exactly what it was. It was fine. I really enjoyed the mix of like Irish folklore mixed with like Norse mythology. I thought that was really interesting, because you kind of had both in this. Obviously, because Kira has like, she's Irish, and then you have Leif, who is Norse. Whatever that means. But it was quite interesting to have the two mixed together. If you want like a fast read, this is pretty good.
The next book I read was Raising Animals for Fiber, Producing Wool from Sheep, Goats, Alpacas, and Rabbits in Your Backyard by Chris McLaughlin. I'm very interested in like wool farming, so I thought might as well start actually reading about stuff. It was pretty good. It was a very basic introduction. Not a great deal of detail, but a good explanation of like, it actually, if you do have a backyard that is moderately large, you could do it. We can't do it here. Like, we could with rabbits actually, but we have a cat, so no. But like, you don't need to own a farm to have farm animals and to like make wool, for example. Was very encouraging for me, because that's what I am interested in. I don't know how interesting this is to anyone watching this. But yeah, there's all sorts of funny looking furry animals that you can shear. Like, it doesn't hurt them to take their fur, just so you know. Like, even the rabbits, you just shear them like you do with sheep. And also, in fact, if you don't do that, they will overheat and die. Cute animals, you should look up Angora goats. They look adorable. Angora rabbits also look adorable.
Next book I read was A Touch of Darkness by Scarlett St. Clair. This is a retelling of Hades and Persephone, kind of set in like modern day. Persephone is a journalist student in her, I think, last year, and she has an internship at like one of the big newspapers in New Athens. Yeah, world building. One day or one night, she goes to a club that is owned by Hades, and at the club, she strikes a bargain with Hades, unknowing that is Hades, and then the bargain is basically that she has to create life in the underworld. This was my jam. I just want to say, this was really good. The other Hades and Persephone retelling that I read a few months ago, garbage. This is what I like. Yes, it's very silly, it's insta love. Who cares? This kind of trash is what I like. I will definitely be reading the other books in the series. That's a given. One of my main issues with this book was that, like, there's a bit of a power imbalance between the two, because obviously she is, like, in, like, a contract with Hades to create this life in the underworld because she's the goddess of spring. So it's kind of like a little bit of a power imbalance. And the second issue I had with this book is Persephone is an intern at this magazine, and then she writes this big article series about Hades, even though she's an intern, which I don't think would happen. You might write like smaller pieces, but I wouldn't think that you would like, oh yeah, you can just write a whole series about like one of the most powerful gods in this world. That was my main issues. Other than that, this was very silly, but I loved it. We'll read all of the other books in the series.
The next book I read was the narrative of The Life of Frederick Douglass by Frederick Douglass. This is autobiography, kind of. It's about him and how he escaped slavery, basically. I found it very readable, except for the fact that basically every page it talks about people torturing people, and that's horrifying. Very important thing to read, and would recommend it to people, but be aware that it talks about like horrific torture and like permanent disfigurement and things like that, so just bear that in mind. Obviously I kind of knew that going in, but I didn't know to what extent it would be discussing that. But as I said, it is actually very readable. It was written in the 19th century, but it has none of the awkwardness that you sometimes get from books written at that time. I didn't find it like difficult in that way. But there's lots of people who wrote in that century and you're just like, what are you talking about? Clear and understandable, and he's just like, this is what's happened to me. It's awful. It shouldn't happen to other people. And he's right. So yeah, I don't really have that much more to say about it. It's just very good. You should read it.
The next book I read is the volume 9 of Jujutsu Kaisen. It's called Premature Death by Gege Akutami. This follows what happened in the previous volume. It kind of concludes the story of getting to know what happened to Gojo in the past, and then kind of starts the next storyline. I enjoyed it. I thought it was really good. It's always nice to get some backstory to what happened to characters. I really liked the art. I love this manga. It's great. Everyone should read it. Everyone is basically reading it. It has like 25 million copies in circulation.
Wow.
Which is pretty good. So yeah, apparently it's gonna end very sad though. That's what the author has said, and I'm like, if anything happens to my boys,
rioting in the streets.
Yes, I will riot. Bad things will probably happen. You should read it. You should definitely watch the anime. The anime is really good.
The next book I read was Elected Friends, Poems for and About Edward Thomas, edited by Anne Harvey. Recently I read another collection, and it also had poems about him at the end, and I thought that was really interesting, so I was kind of interested to see what people were writing about Edward Thomas, who was like this other guy whose name I have forgotten. He was a World War I poet who died in World War I. He's very famous. He wrote a lot of nature poetry, kind of, or talking about England and the countryside and how much he loved the land. To be honest, it was kind of disappointing because a lot of the poems were just like, I went to the same place that he talks about in one of his poems, and it was disappointing. And I'm like, yeah, and this poem was also disappointing. 3 other people that I've read in this collection so far also wrote the same poem as you. Because I thought the poems would be much more sentimental or have more personality and personal impact, whereas a lot of them were just like, I went to see his grave. It's like, okay. So, I mean, most of the poems in this were written after he died, including by people who were not even born when he was alive. So I think it's kind of difficult to have that personal connection with someone if you've literally never met them. I can say that his poetry is quite good, and I have read some of it, so I can recommend his poetry, but I don't think this is really worth it.
The next book I read was The Damned by Renee Audier. This is the second book in the Beautiful series, and I read the first one a few months ago, and this is a sequel, and this was very disappointing. Like, the first one has like a very kind of, it has a vibe that I really enjoyed. Like, not a lot of stuff happened in the book, but I don't mind meandering books so much, and that felt a little bit meandering, which was perfectly fine because the vibe and the setting was really nice, and like the really good chemistry between the two main characters. I was like, yes. And then this book, I don't even know. Like, the first like 300 pages felt a bit unnecessary. It felt like that could have been so much shorter, so much like condensed, and then the last like 100 pages could have been like fleshed out a little bit more. I don't want to like go into exactly what happens because it's spoilers and it will spoil the whole book, but yeah, I really thought I was going to enjoy this. The relationship between the two like main characters, what happened there? Nothing. And then all of a sudden they're back together again. I'm spoiling the book, but this book had such great potential, especially because it introduces more like supernatural beings and like a fae world, and I was like, oh, I like that because I like the Cruel Prince. What was this? Maybe the third book will be better, but I'm also like, don't have the time and energy to put in. Anyway, I do want to read this author's other books because I really like her writing. I think she writes really well, but this series is goodbye. It's over. I definitely want to check out the other two because they're just like duologies, so I don't have to put in too much time and effort into them. You were to show someone!
The next book I read was The Backyard Homestead Guide to Raising Farm Animals by Gail Damerow. Another book. This one was a lot more focused on like meat and milk, which is not really my area. I don't particularly want to slaughter animals, and I don't really care about milk either way, but it was more in depth than the previous book that I read, so it had like really helpful, useful things about like, this is the actual amount of food you should be giving animals, or like, here's how to build a rabbit hutch, things like that. So they were much more practical. It covered a lot of animals that I personally wasn't that interested in. Like, while it would be cool to have cows, I feel like that's not a project that I can take on. And like honeybees, I'm not particularly interested in that. It would be cool to have your own honey, but at what cost, you know? So much work. Anyway, but I thought the writing was really good and engaging, and you know, if you are interested in raising animals in your own backyard even, this book will give you the practical guides for like what you need to do to make sure that your animals are the happiest they can be, and then that they're the most productive that they can be.
The last book I read this month, which I listened to, was a reread of The Secret History by Donna Tartt. I read this actually almost to the day 6 years ago. I read it just before I moved here. This is actually the book, the audiobook is narrated by Donna Tartt herself, which is quite interesting. I listened to like non-fiction books narrated by the authors, but I haven't really listened to a fiction book narrated by the author. But she was really good. She even made like voices for all the characters. I'm like, girl, you're so talented. This follows the narrator of the book is a man called Richard Pepin, and he is from like, I guess, a working class family, and then he goes to the small college in Vermont to study like English and French, but then he is really interested because he studied Greek and he wants to get into this class, but the class is really small and really strangely held, but eventually he is taken into this group and things happen, murder, mystery, intrigue,
Mayhem.
fights, mayhem, love. I really like this book, and upon rereading it, I was like, this is one of my favorite books of all time, probably. It's very, like, contrived also, and very, like, highbrow, but I really like this book, and a lot of people on BookTube and Book Twitter and Book Talk, whatever, likes it too, but I don't know, there's something about this book that just speaks to me. It's also a bit meandering. Again, I love meandering books. But yeah, and the characters are like, they're flawed, really well built, and then you get to know them, and they're just, they're so good. This book is so good, you should read it. But yeah, I mean, obviously, this is like the book that sparked the dark academia trend, I suppose. So, I mean, obviously, it's very white and like upper middle class. So, like, be aware reading this. Also, like, the way it talks about, like, gay people, maybe not the best. Because, like, one of the characters is gay, and they're kind of like, yeah, but we're not gay, but we kind of, like, you know, accept it a little bit on the side, you know, kind of like, and you're like, okay, it's very of its time. I mean, it came out in 1992 as well, and I think it's supposed to be set probably earlier than that. It's of its time, but I still really like this book. You should read it.
The last book I read this month was Minute by Glass Minute by Anne Stevenson. I had previously read some poems by Anne Stevenson, and I liked them, so when I saw this at a charity shop, I thought I should get it. I was right. It's pretty good. It kind of is very abstract and talks about being in places. That sounds very vague, but that is kind of, she talks about being in the US where she's from, and also then being in England and Wales where she lived while she was writing this. So kind of talking about the differences in rural life without necessarily really specifically talking about rural life, but the differences between them, and talking about nature and all kind of vague ideas about things that are happening. I really liked it. I thought it was good, but I do recognize that not everyone would like it. I think it's probably like a specific thing that you've got to be down to read. If you want to read some cool, interesting stuff, you could read this. This came out in the 80s, by the way. The cover is very fun. I don't know. I just think it's great.
That's all we read in September.
Yes.
What did you read in September?
Yes, please tell us. Also, are you going to read any of the books that we read? Because we did have some recommendations, books that we thought people should read.
Yes.
Did you disagree with us about books that we didn't like? Please like and subscribe and all of that good stuff.
And you can follow us on Twitter and Instagram and Goodreads, where we are Tessa Norland. Have a great reading month.
Yes, spooky October season is coming.
Yeah. Hey,
Bye!